Hi everyone. Thank you for joining week 15 of the Sustainable Development Goals for Businesses series. You're all very welcome to today's seminar. My name is Julie Burtz and I will be your MC for today's talk on Sustainable Development Goal 15, Life on Land. SDG15 aims to protect, restore and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, sustainably manage forests, combat desertification and halt and reverse land degradation and halt biodiversity loss. We're delighted here today to be joined by Madlen Sobkowiak, Research Fellow in Accounting at Birmingham Business School, who will discuss drivers and current practices around business measurements and disclosures on biodiversity. Some housekeeping matters before we kick off. Please feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions you may have. Please do note the chat function will be off. At the end, I will ask our speaker to address as many of your questions as is possible in the time available. So with no further delay, I will hand you over to Dr. Madlen Sobkowiak.
Thank you, Julie, and welcome on the webinar for me today as well. As Julie already introduced, my name is Madlen Sobkowiak. I'm currently a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Birmingham, working on a project called Seafood Business for Ocean Stewardship. But before I moved on to a more ocean-focused project, I actually did a PhD looking at biodiversity accounting, and particularly accounting for SDG15, which is life on land. And that's going to be the focus for that presentation today as well, looking first a little bit about what SDG15 is and why it is important for businesses in particular as well, and then talk a little bit about accounting for SDG15. What can we do? What do we know about it? What are the options that we have, and how does accounting fit in that whole narrative of sustainability and biodiversity? So I really like to start off with a quote from Kofi Annan, who was the former Secretary General of the United Nations, who once said that the biggest challenge in this century at the moment is to take the idea that seems abstract, which is sustainable development, and turn it into a reality for all the world's people. And hopefully by the end of today's session, we have a bit of an idea about what that abstract notion of life on land or biodiversity actually is and what we mean when we refer to it, but also how accounting might be a good way of actually turning it into reality for businesses and also for other organizations on this planet. So if you know a little bit about SDGs, or you have been maybe turning into previous sessions here on SDG for businesses, then you should know that the SDGs is a UN framework which combines 17 goals aimed at transforming the world and making it more sustainable. And my focus in particularly, and the focus of my research is in particularly on SDG 15. SDG 15 is the life on land goal and looks particularly on any kind of terrestrial ecosystem and any kind of terrestrial biodiversity. I know biodiversity might be a term for some of you and something that you have heard before. For others, it might be a rather new term. So biodiversity usually refers to any kind of species, and particularly the diversity within species and between different species and ecosystems. So most of the time, what we try to include is any kind of living organism, plant, or species that's on the planet, and try to understand how these species come together to build ecosystems. And biodiversity has gotten quite a bit of media attention and newspaper attention back in 2019. When the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services published their report and actually concluded that biodiversity is in a terrible state at the moment. And our species are currently declining faster than at any time in human history. And that's why scientists sometimes suggest that we are currently in the 6th wave of mass extinction. The first one beforehand were the dinosaurs. So we are currently at a tipping point when it comes to biodiversity, where we recognize we are currently destroying biodiversity in ecosystems quite fast, probably too fast, and we need to actually think about what we can do to better protect them and to make sure that nature and the environment will still be in a good place, even in 10, 15, 20, or 50 years' time. So what does it actually mean? The key thing to always understanding biodiversity is to really understand that ecosystems are like a net, and they're comprised of many different things. And that makes thinking about biodiversity and that makes accounting for biodiversity rather difficult. Because what is it actually that we're referring to when we talk about biodiversity? And there are some obvious things. We might talk about individual species, individual animal groups. The bigger the animals are, the easier we can see them, the easier we can count them. But it also refers to the interaction between these different elements in an ecosystem. And often, if we take out one of these parts of an ecosystem, the whole ecosystem collapses. And we as humans, we are not particularly good at the moment in really understanding how ecosystems work together, how they need each other or what the relationship is. So usually what we're really aiming for is trying to conserve ecosystems as a whole. So rather than just potentially restore certain parts of it or protect individual species, it's really about understanding how everything works together, how everything is connected to each other, and how we have to treat it as a connected system most of the time. So, and we will talk about accounting a little bit later, but it might already come to your mind that then accounting for something that complex and connected isn't really that easy. When we think about other goals, such as carbon, for example, it might lead more easily to a measure. With carbon, we might be able to measure 1 ton of carbon. And it doesn't really matter whether that ton of carbon is emitted in the UK or it's emitted in a different part of the world. At the end of the day, it's 1 ton of carbon. Ecosystems are not that interchangeable. One ecosystem in one part of the world is completely different than an ecosystem in a different part of the world. And it's not that easy to just interchange things like that because they are so regionally specific and work at that many different scales. So thinking about biodiversity can be quite complex and a bit of a problem. And I think that's exactly why I find biodiversity that interesting, because, as I said, it doesn't necessarily lead you to any easy solutions. It doesn't necessarily lead you to any easy measures or thinking about the problem, but really trying to see it as an interconnected system is what we have to do when we think about the issue. One of the goals, and that's not the only international goal, is SDG15. SDG15 really looks at trying to protect, restore, and promote ecosystems, but also forest desertification, land degradation, and biodiversity loss. So it really tries to, again, look at ecosystems a bit more in an interconnected way and trying to not just protect the ones that we have, but also restore things that we might have already destroyed in the past. Under SDG 15, there are a set of different targets, and I'm not going to read through all of them. But if you just have a look at them, there are at the moment 12 different targets underneath that, ranging from a range of different ecosystem approaches, mountain approaches, forest approaches, but also certain things that might be more linked to financial approaches, but also poaching and trafficking. So there's a range of different targets combined, and there are also a range of different indicators actually lying underneath all of these targets that the UN is using. Again, the important thing to remember is it's not the only international framework, but the SDG 15 is really well linked to other international frameworks that exist. So biodiversity has been an issue on the UN level since 1992, when the first UN Convention for Biological Diversity was agreed on. And the last one were the Aichi targets that were running until 2020. And so when the SDGs were agreed on in 2015, they really linked quite nicely with the CBD. So the Convention for Biological Diversity, and really tried to combine the existing international frameworks within the SDG setup. why do we care so much about biodiversity, or why am I making the case here that it's really important to think about the protection and restoration of biodiversity, and particularly terrestrial biodiversity? I know carbon and carbon emissions are a big topic for many people and something that pops up in the media quite a lot. A lot of the solutions that we can come up with for carbon problems are nature-based solutions. So if we are thinking about nature-based solutions to climate issues, we probably won't be able to achieve it, but we could theoretically get around a third of the CO2 reductions by 2030 over nature-based solutions to the problem. You probably are aware that forests are particularly great in terms of carbon solutions. But mountain regions, for example, as different ecosystems are also incredibly important. 60 to 80% of the Earth's fresh water is provided by mountain regions. So thinking about these as a particular ecosystem, and you have seen that previously, it's a special target underneath it is quite important. When we talk about ecosystems, a lot of the time nowadays, we are also talking about something called ecosystem services. And ecosystem services are the idea that the ecosystems actually provide a lot of services that we as a society and we as humans depend on. And the estimation is that the value of the current ecosystem services is actually around 125 trillion US dollars each year. So ecosystems are incredibly important and they provide a range of different services to us. You might be thinking about some of the straightforward ones where we take certain natural resources in terms of businesses and production lines, but think about other ecosystem services as well when it comes to pollination, the provision of fresh water, the provision of natural resources, climate kind of mitigation effects, soil mitigation effects. All of these are services that we as a society really depend on. So when it comes to protecting biodiversity, it's not just a thing that is good to do for the sake of it, or it's not just a charitable thing to do. It's actually something that we have to do if we want to function as a society and if we want a businesses to thrive on that planet in the future as well. Forests, for example, are one of the ecosystems that are quite often looked at because forests can host more than 80% of all terrestrial species, including animal, plants, and insects. So you might have heard about particularly rainforests and some of the concerns that are when it comes to the loss of rainforests that we have every year, whether it's around Brazil or in other parts of the world, because losing that amount of forest is going to be particularly dangerous when it comes to extinction rates, but also the kind of services that forests provide. So often we look at things like forests or mountains, given that they are that important for the functioning of the planet and the societies. So that's pretty much why I would argue we have to care about it, besides, of course, the fact that nature has a right in its own to exist around us, and that we as humans are only a part of nature. And we have to make sure that the whole thing, the whole planet is going to be in a healthy state. What is the current state of biodiversity? It doesn't look that great. When we look at extinction rates, the extinction rates have been through the roof in the last 100 years or so, and pretty much across all different species categories. So amphibians are one of the worst ones, but you see it in mammals and birds and reptiles and fishes. You can pretty much pick whatever a species category you want, and you will see that the extinction rates are a lot higher than you would expect natural extinction rates to be. So we're losing species just at a rate that we probably can't afford to as a planet and as societies. And what you can also see when you look at the red list is one of these indexes that's trying to classify species based on their risk of getting extinct. So usually you classify species based on, are they common or are they maybe threatened or vulnerable to extinction? And there are different levels of which they can be. And what we would want to see is things moving from a threatened category into a more common kind of category, but it doesn't really happen that often. We have a few examples where we could save individual species, and that's positive examples showing that biodiversity protection can work. But if we look at it on a global scale, and if we look at all categories, what we see is that it actually gets worse. Again, across all categories, we are losing a lot of different species, and we are having quite a few species moving further down into the red area of being vulnerable to extinction or threatened with extinction. So it's one of these points where we see, when we look at the data, that we are in a dangerous state at the moment, that we really have to think about what can we do about it and how can we address the issue. You don't have to look at all these indicators, but this is just an assessment in terms of the past on the left hand, the 5 categories, and the current trends when it comes to the status of biodiversity. And you don't have to be an expert to realize that nearly everything is red. And red in that scenario means it's getting worse. And it's not just getting worse over the last 10, 15 years, but it's actually getting worse over the last 70 years. And it doesn't currently look like it's getting that much better. And as I said, we have these international agreements, we have these international targets already since 1992. So biodiversity isn't a new thing. Being aware of biodiversity loss isn't a new thing. But so far, society doesn't seem to be acting on it, or doesn't seem to be particularly effective in acting on these kind of threats and really doing something for biodiversity on a global scale. So that to me seems really, really dangerous and particularly threatening, considering that there is basically no category in the terrestrial indicator set that's actually improving, even though we have these goals. So I think we need to think a little bit more carefully about how can we translate these international goals and these international targets into an organizational setting, and how can we actually then think about measuring a performance in that area. What does it mean for someone to have a positive impact on biodiversity? How could we measure it? How would we know whether we are improving in that area? And again, how could organizations quantify their impact in these areas? What are the main drivers for biodiversity loss? Quite simply speaking, there's a range of different direct and indirect drivers, but most of them are linked to us, humans. There are suggestions that we are now living in an era called the Anthropocene, which means that we as humans are the main drivers of change on this planet. And it's the first time in the history of the planet that there is one single species really driving change on all of these different levels. Most of these drivers are linked to the way we are living, linked to the way we are doing businesses, linked to the way we are using land, but also, of course, linked to things like pollution, climate change, and so on. Because nature is one of these aspects, you always need to see it as an interconnected thing. So, of course, climate change has an impact on biodiversity, the same way as biodiversity has an impact on climate change. And you see that the similar thing with pollution, which is a massive problem that we are facing on the planet at the moment. So just to draw it out a little bit more clearly, what's the link between business and biodiversity? It's important to understand that biodiversity is nothing that's just out there and that governments are going to solve. That's not going to happen, because the impact that businesses have on biodiversity is far too large to just rely on some government regulation in the area. Often, as I said, companies actually rely on a range of different services. So more and more companies over the last few years have realized their dependency on these services. Again, it's not just a nice thing to do, a good thing to do, to think about ecosystem restoration or ecosystem protection. It's actually something that a lot of business models rely on. I'm currently working in a fishery industry, which isn't necessarily life on land, but life underwater. And the current rate of overfishing and plastics and antibiotics and all of the problems that we're facing in that area, there are estimations that commercial fishery won't be possible in 15 to 20 years' time anymore if we are not combating the loss of species and the overfishing at the point now. Because as I said, most companies rely on some kind of ecosystem service. Even companies who might not use natural resources still rely on things like flood control, climate change, overheating services that nature is providing for everyone. So it's not just about companies who might use natural resources directly, but also about indirect services nature provides. Businesses can contribute nicely to SDG 15 if they wanted to. And one thing that I would argue is a key thing is for businesses to start measuring their impact on biodiversity. Start by measuring, because only if you measure something, you can then think about how you manage it and how can you mitigate the impact. So what ways that I've seen companies do it? Most of the time, companies have started implementing some form of strategy. So we are now at a level where a lot of companies have strategies in place where they try to incentivize a more sustainable use of land or forest management and aim for more environmental stewardship approach. The problem that I see at the moment is that doesn't necessarily translate to outcomes and measurable impacts yet. So I think that's the stage where we are lacking a little bit at that point in time. But as I said, if we wanted to secure the supply of natural resources and raw material, companies have to increase the efforts in terms of also restoring degraded land rather than just trying to not making it worse. So we are now at a point where just not making it worse won't cut it anymore, but we actually have to do some positives as well. So there are these two things. It's not just, on the one hand, we're trying to avoid harm, but we're also trying to restore things at the same time. Because just avoiding harm, I think we are over that point a little bit by now. We really have to think about restoring things that we have destroyed in the last 70 or 100 years already. On the right-hand side, you can just see a graph of the percentage of listed companies that have biodiversity policies. And you can see, as I said earlier, there's increasing numbers across all sectors of companies implementing some sort of a biodiversity policy. The problem with that is, you can see in some of these sectors, it's still fairly low. So we might in some sectors are between 10 to 15% of listed companies having biodiversity policies in place. But what I think is even worse, that it doesn't currently really translate to a measurable or reported outcome on these issues. So while companies put more policies and strategies in place, we can't really see that leading to any kind of reported or measurable outcomes yet. There was a study in 2018 looking at the sustainability reporting of the top 100 out of the Fortune 500 companies. Less than half of them mentioned biodiversity. That's fair enough, but the problem is only a third of them have really clear biodiversity commitments. Only 5 reports are actually commitments that were in any way time-bound or measurable, 5 out of 100 companies. And only 9 of these 100 companies had some form of quantitative biodiversity indicator. So even the ones that had some kind of biodiversity commitment, a lot of them were not able to report in a quantitative, measurable way on them, which makes it hard to really track what the impact is. It makes it hard to think about how would we measure whether we are improving in that area or not. And I think that's a main problem, particularly when we think about how can we better link companies and company impact actually to SDG 15. Biodiversity accounting as a research area isn't that new. It sounds like, I think for many people, it sounds like a little bit of a niche research area, and I can see why. But it's been going on for around 2 decades now, and has looked at different methods and tools that accounting can actually bring to the table when it comes to biodiversity conservation. The main focus has often been on reporting. So how can companies improve their biodiversity reporting? How can companies include information on their biodiversity impact within their sustainability report or other forms of public statement or reporting that they are doing? The main findings of most of these papers are that companies are currently not really reporting, that the reporting is of a fairly poor quality, and it's often not linked to the impacts. So even if companies report some information on biodiversity, it doesn't really say anything about the impact that that company has. It's quite often fluffy. It doesn't really tell you much, if they even have something. But most companies, as I said earlier, don't even report anything on biodiversity or land in that sense yet. Another stream of research has looked at certifications. And I think certifications might be something that we are all aware of. You can find it every time you go to a supermarket. Every product now has a range of different certifications and labels stick on them that are supposed to tell you as a consumer about whether that product is sustainable or not. And there are, again, a few papers looking at biodiversity certifications. And even there, the outcome usually is that it doesn't necessarily lead to better biodiversity practices. And I think it's not that much of a surprise. You may have heard of things like greenwashing before, where companies really like to present something as being sustainable without necessarily changing the production line, or just changing it to a certain level of fulfilling the certification scheme, but not actually making some kind of long-lasting effect. Other methods that have been looked at is something like offsetting. Offsetting might be something you've heard of from a carbon accounting perspective. So when we talk about carbon markets, we are talking about carbon offsetting. And the main idea is that you look at your negative impact in an area. In biodiversity, you look at your negative biodiversity impact, and then you're trying to see, is there anything of that you can avoid? Is there anything you can minimize? So that you end up with a residual impact. So that's a negative biodiversity impact that under no circumstances can you avoid having. Every business will have some form of negative impact that they just can't avoid. And that's then the impact that you're trying to offset by a positive action or positive conservation. So at the end of the day, you're always aiming to be at least zero, meaning your positive impact is as big as your negative impact. In some cases, you might even aim to have a positive impact, a net positive impact, by increasing your positive, so your positive impact is bigger than your residual negative impact. And that would be something like a biodiversity gain or net positive impact that you're trying to achieve. A lot of these methods, or a lot of the biodiversity offsetting schemes, have been criticized in the literature fairly heavily because they have been allowing companies to legitimize biodiversity destruction through an offsetting scheme, but they also often are quite good at hiding things. So just when you look at that one graph on the right-hand side, it's from a company report, but it doesn't really tell you anything about the company impact. You can't see what exactly companies are destroying, what are the affected ecosystems, the affected species, what's really going on. You don't get any feeling about the impact of the company, besides that at the end of the day, they tell you they have a positive impact. So everything can be quite hidden in the accounts. So biodiversity offsetting is quite controversial. I know there's the last paper, the Caxton paper, looked at a more ecological defensible kind of set of offsetting. And I know there's some work going on in making offsetting schemes better in terms of the ecological impact. But at the moment, it seems like, again, that's a practice where we are not 100% sure to what extent it will really bring long-lasting effects. And the last practice that I'm going to talk about is indicators. This is my expertise, this is what I'm looking at, where the idea is to really think about how can we make the performance in biodiversity areas measurable? How can we calculate for something like biodiversity in a way that allows us to then think about actions or policies or strategies that we have to actually take in order to address these concerns. Given that companies aren't particularly great, for my PhD, I looked at the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs here in the UK. Therefore, that actually do have a set of biodiversity indicators that they publish annually since 2007. And what I try to understand is, how have they been able to do that? What actually goes underneath preparing such a report? What are the key things that you have to bring together in order to allow biodiversity to be represented in that set of report and that set of indicators? And that's a paper that comes out from my PhD on the right-hand side, published in a AAAJ, Accounting, Accountability and Auditing Journal. So if you're keen on having a look at that, feel free to check out that paper, but I'm going to talk you through a little bit of the key findings within that paper. What we found is that the organization alone, therefore, was not able to produce it on themselves, which isn't surprising considering the complexity involved in biodiversity, as I mentioned earlier. But actually, this kind of calculability was depending on a lot of different actors, and included a different range of research centers, academia, but also NGOs. They were absolutely aware that anything they were doing was imperfect. And I think that's one thing to remember every time we talk about sustainability measurements or biodiversity measurements. We are probably going to do things that are imperfect and that are not 100% accurate, and that have to be excluded certain things at certain points in time just for practical reasons. So what they also did was they actually adjusted that set of measurement pretty much on an annual basis. So constantly trying to improve what they were doing, constantly reviewing what they had, constantly working with a range of different actors and trying to identify how they can make these things better, which is a little bit going against the accounting principles that we often have, where we're trying to have comparability and consistency over a longer period of time. Whereas they say consistency is not really what we're too worried about, because if we are consistent about doing something in a bad way, it's not going to help us. We're rather trying to improve the practices in terms of what we are accounting and how we are accounting it. But the key thing that we noticed was it wasn't really that people thought about what indicators do we want, and then they thought, okay, what data do we then have to collect in order to report these indicators? It was actually the other way around. Quite often, the accounting structure was largely influenced by the data availability. So whatever data they had available was pretty much driving what they were reporting, which again isn't that big of a surprise, considering that collecting biodiversity data on a large scale is incredibly time consuming, extremely expensive, and just not really practical. But what we noticed at that point was that while the UK had these kind of set with 24 indicators in place since 2007, when it came to reporting the SDG15 indicators back in 2015, they actually really struggled because it was a different set of indicators. And even though they were compliant with all international frameworks before, and the SDGs again built on all the existing indicator framework, accounting for it on the indicator level was completely different. And what the UK did is, rather than the Department of Environment doing the SDG reporting, they outsourced it to the Office for National Statistics. So they just didn't really use it in any decision making. SDG15 wasn't really, the indicators for SDG15 wasn't really a thing that was driving any decision making, because you just excluded the indicator reporting, and they focused on their own bottom-up indicators that they were using for a long time, that they had the data on, and that they really constructed themselves. Because they found them to be a lot more decision useful and a lot more focused on the specifics of UK ecosystems, looking at a different scale what they needed, whereas they found the international top-down ones to just be too broad and not really helpful in making any decisions whatsoever. So that's a quote that I really like from one of the participants, who said, actually, the UK accounting system for biodiversity is built on the history that they had. So they have this history of people going out recording nature. So a lot of it, volunteers drive the reporting, because they go out and they report bird species and things like that. And there is a certain sort of civil infrastructure around, but it's something that's evolved. It's not something that you could necessarily design. And that's a key thing. It's not something, if you would give someone a blank sheet of paper and say, what indicators would you love to report on, and how do you want to do it? The system wouldn't be the same as what they have in place now. But that's the only thing that they can do at the moment. And that's pretty much the process how it was. I'm not going to expect you to look at everything in detail. That's not the key thing. But what you can see is it's not linear. There is no linear approach. It's not easy. It involves a range of different actors at different stages throughout the process. Often it starts with data being collected by outside organizations. So it's NGOs, it's research centers, it's academia that collect the data for their use, for whatever they want to use it. And then that data is being transformed into national indicators at a later point in time. And there's a range of different organizations, as I said, working together at that stage. And they also have something called an indicator forum. We have range of different external stakeholders constantly reviewing what's going on. And only after that transformation process is when they are able to report that indicator, which is a report, which of course then is being used in a range of different things and feeds back into a range of different policy processes, which then indeed feed back also into the construction process of the indicator for the next year. So what can you see? First of all, I think if organizations really want to contribute better to conservation, then extensive capacity building will be necessary. I expect that companies currently don't have the capacity within to report on biodiversity in a really complex and interconnected way. What we also saw, as I said, top-down standards were pretty much superficial. They will not be able to use these kind of standards for decision-making or informing decision-making, but they rather preferred having their bottom-up, locally specific biodiversity indicators, because that really informed them about what's going on in that particular area. Top-down standards, as I said, biodiversity is just not really interchangeable on a global level, so it made it really difficult to have indicators that are specific enough on a scale that could really inform decision-making. There's extensive work going on when it comes to finding and detaching relevant data, which is the first step. You need to think about the data first. Where do you get the data? How do you detach it from nature that's going on? How do we transform it into a data set? How can you then manipulate and transform the data set into indicators? And then reporting is only the last stage of that process. So if you think about companies and how companies can better report on it, you should not start with the reporting. The reporting is the last thing. You should actually start thinking about the previous steps that are necessary. And what we also saw is there won't be a perfect way to do it. So if you design a biodiversity accounting system, you would have to think about mechanisms that you can implement in a system that could continue drive and refinement and improvement in the system. So accounting for biodiversity at the moment is not something where you just implement a system and leave it there and hope everything will just work out and you just pull out your data at the end of the year. But it's actually something that does take a lot of work in terms of reviewing, refining, thinking about what is the newest scientific development, what new data sources might become available, how can we better do it, what better modeling can go in. So we are not at a point yet where we just implement a system and say, that's perfect, we move on. But I would argue that having something that might be a little bit imperfect is still better than having nothing. And currently what we see in many organizations is they have nothing or they report nothing, which I think is a bigger problem than potentially reporting something that you would have to update in a year or in 5 years' time. Just as a summary, I hope that you have understood that SDG15 and terrestrial biodiversity is currently a key concern. There's a reason that we have that goal on an international level, because the status of biodiversity isn't great, but we need it for the functioning of the societies and also businesses. Businesses, my experience, rely heavily on these kind of services. And some of them have now started to realize that they have to really step up to contribute to the protection of ecosystems. My experience is that companies do have a lot of room for improvement when it comes to particularly measuring and managing and reporting their biodiversity impact. So most of the companies have not really done it yet. So there is a lot that could be done on a practical level in improving that. But if we wanted to do it, most likely it will require massive capacity building and therefore collaborations. I would expect that companies would struggle if they try to do it on their own. Whereas what we have seen companies do a lot better if they decide to work together with NGOs, if they decide to work together with academia or research centers, and really try to draw on that expertise that already exists in these communities. There is a lot of expertise in NGOs, there's a lot of expertise in research and academia that companies can actually draw on, and also data set that they can use in order to measure their own impact, which is a lot more practical than asking companies to start with a blank sheet of paper and just do it on their own. That was pretty much the part of me just talking to you guys. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have now.
Thank you, Madlen. That was wonderful, very insightful. And again, just to reiterate, we do have the opportunity that you can put your question in the Q&A box down below. And I see there is one question for you. The global average of the Sustainable Competitiveness Index was 46 in 2020. Can we reach the 100% for 2030 in a global scale? Wow.
It's a difficult question for me to answer because, of course, I can't see in the future and I don't know what it is. I'm a bit wary about that 2030 goal, if I'm honest, because currently we are not progressing fast enough. To be honest, when we looked at the Aichi targets, we pretty much failed all 2020 Aichi targets. Across the board, they weren't achieved. It doesn't mean that we won't be able to achieve things by 2030 just because we haven't achieved things in the past. But I don't know. I hope we can improve. I don't think we necessarily hit the 100, but I would like to see that number going up, because what we have at the moment is things are getting worse. They are not just not achieving 100%, but in many areas we fail to make an improvement at all. So I would like to start seeing improvement first before we talk about maybe hitting 100% in these areas.
Great, thank you. I have a question for you. There's so much there, first of all, to take in, and I'm coming more with the management accounting role and focusing in on your performance indicators, and just trying to get my own head around it. And I suppose I was thinking, what are the indicators that companies are going to be calculating? So I was just thinking, you know, maybe it's to do with trees and the soil quality and all of these things. So they're kind of non-financial. And then would companies come along then and match a cost to the non-financial? And so I have a number of questions, and I'm probably I'll give you a chance. First of all, in coming up with your indicators, if I was at home in my organization and saying this is the way we're going, would I be kind of linking the cost to the non-financial I had established, or how would I start to go about it?
That's a really good question, because it's actually a question where you ask 5 people, you will probably get 5 different answers to it. Monetizing biodiversity is quite debated in the literature, to say it nicely. So on the one hand, we have things like ecosystem services that rely heavily on the monetization of a service and really try to drive businesses by making that argument of like, they provide you things and you can calculate the cost of destroying things, but you can also calculate the benefit of keeping things or restoring things. So what we have seen is that actually they seem to be a good tool if you wanted. It seems to be a good tool to connect it sometimes to monetizing, if you wanted to communicate to certain business leaders, to CEOs, and the business community like that kind of language. And you probably know, as a management accounting, you sometimes like to do it because it helps you in certain decisions. I'm a bit skeptical of that approach, because quite often it also justifies the destruction of things that aren't seen as valuable enough, and it would allow the destruction of certain parts of ecosystems where you couldn't find the value yet. But I think given that they are so interconnected, we wouldn't really know what the effect is of destroying certain parts of the ecosystem before it's too late. So I'm a bit worried of that. The indicators that I'm looking at, most of them are non-financial indicators. So often they are, as you said, either species-specific indicators, so certain species counts that are identified as key species. So species which usually represent the health of a particular ecosystem or give you indications about certain indicators, certain ecosystems, so key species indicators, for example, but also, as you said, things about the health of, or the soil quality, or the air quality, the pollution levels that are going on in certain parts. So a lot of them are ecologically driven indicators rather than financially driven indicators. The set that I'm looking at, I don't think they have monetized any of these indicators. But as I said, I definitely see the argument of monetizing them, because you can see that it's a good way of communicating with certain business leaders. And it seems to be getting sometimes a bigger impact if you can monetize it than if you can't. So I think it's, at the end of the day, it's about balance. And trying to maybe combine both sides of the story and trying to make a case on different levels. Because we need to attack the problem at different scales, at different levels. We just have to be, of course, aware of, if we only look at financial information in that area, we might be actually making having a huge problem in ignoring other parts that don't seem valuable to us. And there, of course, are ethical and philosophical implications about, are we as humans really, can we just financialize nature in that level? And can we justify the destruction of nature with financial terms? But
yeah, you know, the whole story, there's so many embedded parts to it from what I can see. And really, the one thing striking me is human behavior, human thinking, and how we act. And it just strikes me, because you were talking about government. So I'm making the assumption you have someone preparing these performance indicators. So they're in the, we'll say in the offices, and they're gathering all the data, putting it together so that you have the data, or the performance indicator, we shall say, and then what's done with it. And then if you think about feeding into policy, decision making, etc., my whole thing comes with, how do you get the politicians who vote in, you know, legislation, etc., to work with that? Because just even thinking from some of my own research years ago, hearing how local politicians knew, you know, that what was to increase, we'll say, water costs and charge domestic was the way to go, so that we'd have a better water system. And they knew that was the right way to go, but their constituents didn't want water charges, so they were going to vote against increasing water charge because they didn't want their constituents to see that they went against them. So there's all these little factors. How do you balance all of this out long term?
Absolutely, and I agree with you. Tracing the policy impact is actually a difficult one, because there is no linear impact. And I had some, as you said, local policy people who told me that their constituents are also more worried about not seeing certain birds than they're necessarily with a financial system of an ecosystem service thing that they had. So there it was, even then the non-financialized indicators were a lot more driving things on a local level, whereas the financialized ones were more driving them on a UK-wide policy system. Because, as you said, normally is no one going around and wondering about the ecosystem service decline. You wonder about the nature you have in front of your doorstep. But it is difficult. What I noticed is a lot of policy isn't necessarily made by politicians. It's enforced by politicians. It's made in the offices. It's made by a lot of public service staff who prepare briefings, who set up this evidence base to support things. So there is a certain detachment between sometimes the evidence that we have and the politics that come out at the end of the process, which is worrying at times, and I agree with you. But I think the whole policy making process is such a complex field on its own that I could probably talk for another hour just about that. And I've seen that there's a different question, so I might move on.
Yes, so that's great, thank you. So the next question is, how do modern companies understand the impact of their end-to-end supply chains on biodiversity when we mostly work through wholesalers and distributor models? How can we get a real picture of what impact a company has on biodiversity, for example?
That's a really, really good question, particularly when we look at modern supply chains. And it's a similar problem whether we look at biodiversity, whether we look at human rights and things like that, or whether we look at carbon at the end of the day, because even there we have different scopes of carbon that we can measure, whether it's direct impact from the organization going through their supply chain, or even indirect impact. And I think similar ideas of scales have to be applied to biodiversity. So you might have a scale 1 biodiversity approach where you say that's the direct impact that organization has. Tracing it more indirectly is a bit difficult. When I work with companies, it can take years for them to get the data together. So we're currently working with a company in a different sector that has done more than, I think, a year or even 2 years of work just trying to trace their impact in certain species and extinction species, getting the data together because they don't have that information yet at all if you look at supply chains. So there's definitely a lot of work that would have to go into it. But the point is, I think it would be good if we would have that in the future. But again, I think starting maybe with scale 1, what's the direct impact the organization has would be a good starting point. And then similarly to carbon, trying to increase the scale and trying to see what's the first level of supply chain. What is the impact there? What's the second level of supply chain? What are the indirect things that we rely on as an organization when it comes to infrastructure and similar things? It will take a while. I don't expect that to be an issue that we just solve in the next 2 years and we move on. I think it will be something that takes a lot of capacity building, as I said, a lot of time, but we have to start somewhere. So when I work with companies, usually we try to start at some point of what data is already there, because sometimes they don't even know that they have the data. They collect more than they necessarily analyze or report. Or is there anyone that has some data that you could use as a starting point? And then over years of refining, you try to improve that setup. You try to include more scales. You try to work and through the supply chain. But I agree, getting an idea about the supply chain at the moment is a big task. In my experience, it takes years for the company to get a better impact, picture of what their impact is. But again, I just would like some of them to start, to be fair. So, yeah.
Again, I suppose if consumers are pushing for it, it'll push businesses to change as well. So if society changes and we all, make those adjustments and stuff and become more conscientious and grateful for the earth we live on, we might get there. But I suppose it's day by day. We have one more question here, because I'm conscious that you have a lecture at 2. There is a recent CHAI report which shows that manufacturing is the main cause of environmental impact over logistics. Is this something that there is awareness?
There is an awareness of that at some level. But also, I haven't worked enough with logistics companies and that setup to know 100% what the awareness in these companies is. My experience with different sectors is that the awareness has been increasing over the last 5 years or so. There are certain companies that are doing a lot better in the industry than other companies. And I would expect that to be similar to the logistics sector, where I would expect some companies to be aware of that and maybe trying to tackle it, but not all of them yet. But I haven't worked with anyone in that area yet, so I can't really tell you exactly what the awareness of the CEOs in that area is.
And just to say that the CHAI is the Clinton Health Access Initiative for anyone listening there. So I think we're going to wrap it up. And I have to say, before we do, my sincere thanks to you, Dr. Madlen Sobkowiak, for taking the time to join us today. It was such an insightful, thought-provoking presentation. And I think we've all enjoyed this hour, and it was a worthwhile hour. And thank you too to everyone who joined and your questions and participation for this hour, making it much more enjoyable. And just before you go, just to let you know that we will be holding Sustainable Development Goal 16, Peace, Justice and Strong Institutions on the 31st of March with Elizabeth David Barrett and Robert Gillanders. So we'll be circulating a new registration link on our SDG4B website and .lab channels for everyone who'd like to listen in. And again, our heartiest thanks to you for joining us today, Madlen. And I hope your lecture goes well.
Thank you. And thank you, Julie, for the moderation as well. And thank you everyone who attended. And of course, do feel free to follow up with me if there are any questions or anything that you think is worth discussing. I'm sure you can find my contact details online as well. So feel free to catch up if there's anything that you feel you want to discuss later on. Thank you, everyone.
Excellent. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great afternoon. Bye.